Greetings, everybody. CyberTile back with you with all things chess. We're going to continue our examination of hanging pawns. This will probably be one of our last examinations of the e4, or in this case e5 pawn break against the hanging pawns. Then we'll move on to examining b4 breaks. This is a bit of a classic game. It's another game that I think has been completely mismanaged in a lot of instructional books, which, as I've been preparing for this series, I've seen a lot of those. I would say the computer revolution has really also revolutionized how we look at chess. It's made our analysis of games much more objective. Everyone's had to up their game in terms of analysis. You can't just create flowery stories about a game anymore, because that quickly gets uncovered, and the actual thread of the game gets uncovered very easily. But this is Laios Portisch against Anatoly Karpov, 1978, so this is after Karpov won the world championship by default in 1975. Karpov was black, d4. By the way, hot take for the day, I think Karpov would have beaten Fischer in 75, but come at me, bro. E3, this is Rubinstein against the Nimzo Indian. Most popular and definitely the most solid against the Nimzo Indian, I would say. Castle, this is the most popular move. B6, I would say, is the most strategically interesting. It's the most hyper-modern-y, if not really a word, but hyper-modern-y way of playing against the Nimzo, or playing with the Nimzo. The bishop can come to B7 to immediately fight for the E4 square, or it can even come to A6 to try to attack this c-pawn. C5, this used to be popular, but this isn't in favor anymore because of knight e2. And white tends to be better in all theoretical lines. D5, also an older move. This is really looked down upon now. This is seen as strategically risky. A3, and this whole line is basically forced. And knight e2 is the key move. If white were to play knight f3 here, black would be fine. Black could just play bishop g4 immediately. And black's perfectly equal. Knight e2 is the key move here. And this is an improved samish variation against the Nimzo. The knight comes to e2 to stop that bishop g4 move. Now, if black played bishop g4, white would just play f3, and that's a waste of time. Basically, the knight comes to e2, black's unable to activate this light squared bishop, and it leaves the f3 square available for this pawn. So then white's able to play f3, followed by e4. The key instructional game, and really the start of this structure, was Botvinnik Capablanca, Avro 1938, if you're looking for more instructional material. That's a game I've mentioned a few other times in this series. White's simply better here. That's been well resolved for, I'd say, 40 or 50 years at this point. Castle is the most solid. Bishop d3, c5, castle. And this is one of the major tabias of the entire Nimzo Indian. Black can make a choice here about what structure we're headed towards. In the game, Karpov chooses dx-c4, which is one major way. Knight c6 is another major choice. This is a smaller part of my repertoire, but I play it a lot in blitz chess. a3, then bishop a5. The normal move here is bishop takes c3. And then queen c7 is one of the main moves here. Bishop a5 is called the Reykjavik variation, so named because of Fischer's use of this variation in his match against Spassky in 1972 in Reykjavik. Black just sort of holds serve here and waits for white to commit to something. There's only one critical line here. If white were to play like a pass move with this, Black can sort of unveil his point against this. And then maybe even play h6. This is just a better hanging pawn structure for black, because this bishop on a5 is actually fairly active. It's better than it would be on e7, because now the bishop can come to b6 at some point to directly pressure the a-side pawn. And that's typically not a piece arrangement you see in a structure like this. The only critical line for black is white taking on d5. And this is sort of mainline modern theory, knight x d5. And black has ample compensation for the pawn. His knights are active. White's pawn structure is in complete shambles. Black's very likely to get the pawn back more or less immediately. But white has the bishop pair, and in modern chess, the bishop pair compensates for a lot. The bishop pair is almost always an asset that you want. So, more or less just an interesting position. I think it's fun to play. The DXC4, it's more technically oriented, so it definitely fits Karpov's style a bit better. CXD4, so this is leading towards the Karpov variation. This is one of the games that established the Karpov in modern mainline theory. Knight BD7 is my personal choice. Basically, black doesn't commit to CXD4 because that opens up a path of development for the Starsport bishop. Knight BD7 develops and forces white to commit to something before black does anything. So, the main line, A3, bishop A5, this is the best move. Notice that this is just better for white, because now if black takes on D4, he won't get hanging pawns out of it. The C pawn will just take back. And then white will own the center and have the bishop pair, which that is just an edge for white. Bishop A5 holds serve. We take on D4, then we take on C3. And this is a fun and balanced position. White has the bishop pair, but he has these hanging pawns. Black can hope to arrange counterplay against the hanging pawns at some points. Balanced position, in my opinion. This is fun to play. CXD4 is a little bit more direct. B6. So this is the Karpov variation. This is excellent for black. The downside to this is that there's quite a bit of direct theory to this, and a lot of the theory leads to forced draws. There's a lot of sharper variations in this theory that lead to repetition or something like that. If you're a super GM playing in a double round robin, that's okay. If you're playing in a weekend Swiss and your opponent is white as low rated and he knows the drawing theory, that can be a problem. So it just depends on what type of chess you play. If you're 1600 and you're playing in a weekend Swiss, the forced draw doesn't matter because your opponent's not going to know the forced draw theory. You can just play chess. So if you're comfortable with this, B6 is a great move because it's resolving that light square bishop problem. Knight BD7. This is another popular choice. This is the choice of Anand's. I think that I prefer this a little bit as black just because it avoids the drawing theory. Then Queen F5. This is a different approach. Black's just immediately pressuring white's position with pieces. And I think black is perfectly fine here. Black can always trade on C3. The queen coming to A5, it actually gives it a couple of more active squares. You can hop to H5, directly pressure this bishop on H4. But B6 was played. 5. This is all mainline theory, so this can pass by without comment. Bishop x C3. So we can sneer at this because this is back in 1978. So this was when the theory of this line was roughly in its infancy. So it's easy to sneer and snarl with a move like this, but this is inaccurate. Basically, this is this leads to a very favorable hanging pawn structure for white. White owns the bishop pair. That's always an asset. Black doesn't have a way to generate pressure against these hanging pawns because this knight's on D7. If this knight were on C6, it could hop to A5 potentially and pressure the pawn on C4 when it shows up on C4. But it's committed to D7, and it doesn't really have a great way to get over to pressure the hanging pawns. Better for black, and this is reflected in modern theory, just H6, gaining time against that bishop, and then bishop E7. So this is a good hanging pawn, or this is a good isolated pawn, my apologies. The difference between a hanging pawn structure and an isolated queen pawn structure is very slight because, as we discussed at the beginning of this module, you can transpose between those at the drop of a hat. So you have to be prepared to evaluate which one is better with all the positional features. What swings the difference for me, this is a good isolated queen pawn for black because he's already resolved this light squared bishop. That bishop has a fantastic diagonal. This isn't a terribly aggressive isolated pawn for white. White hasn't achieved key attacking moves like Knight E5 yet. He doesn't have a mating battery with Bishop C2 and Queen D3 set up yet. Rook C1 really doesn't fit in a lot of these structures. It's not a bad move, but Rook C1 doesn't really advance any of White's attacking ideas on the king side. So this isn't an aggressive isolated queen pawn for White, and typically that means it's just better for Black than average, because White wants to be generating aggressive attacking plans when he has the isolated pawn. If he's not generating those, typically that allows Black to mobilize get a grip on the isolated pawn, and then start generating pressure against the isolated pawn. So bishop x c3 is a mistake because it leads to an unfavorable hanging pawn structure. This would be a favorable isolated queen pawn. I would say this is balanced. This isn't necessarily worse for white, but black actually scores better than 50% here. So bishop x c3, this is just too favorable and hanging pawn structure for white. This is everything that he wants. c4. So again, notice how that these knights are sort of stepping on one another's toes. This knight doesn't really have a good square to hop to, which means this knight doesn't have any scope at all, because it's sort of locked into sitting with this knight, which means basically the only piece that black can move is this rook. Now, black's very solid. He doesn't have any weaknesses. He's well placed to face any of white's advances, but that's a passive stance. He's not generating his own activity. And generally, in any level of chess, you want to be generating your own activity. So rook fe8, this is fairly standard. Queen e2, bishop h4, I think is a little bit more accurate. It's planning bishop g3 to harass his queen on c7. Queen f4, if he plays knight f8, just an example of what you can do against a passive line. c5, this looks surprising because it looks positionally ugly to give it the d5 square. But remember that these hanging pawns are also mobile, and that this c-pawn can just become a very strong passed c-pawn. Combined with the bishop pair, this is just, in my opinion, a better position for white. Just an example line. Knight g6. This is probably best play for black, but I think this is definitely better for white. White's got the bishop pair, he's more active, he's got pressure on this b6 pawn. If black were to trade on c5, that really would just become a very strong passed c-pawn. This is a very nice position for white. Queen f4 is another line. But white's very well placed here as well. White's pawn structure is completely shattered. He's got the hanging pawns. Basically, all of his pawns are either isolated or hanging or doubled. But the bishop pair and white's activity are the factors that matter, because black's position is very passive. He doesn't have any pressure against those pawns. The only way to say something is a weakness is if it's being attacked. If you're not attacking the theoretical pawn weaknesses, they're not weaknesses. The only thing that matters here are white's bishop pair and white's activity. So bishop h4, in my opinion, is a little bit more accurate, more aggressive. Queen e2 is a little bit routine. I think white's still slightly better here, just because this is a favorable hanging pawn structure, but he could have shot for more. h6, gaining time, that's normal. Bishop d2. Bishop xf3. So this is where the instructional books, and I saw this in a couple of older books that I was browsing through to look for sources for this video. This is where you really see the difference between older analysis and newer analysis. This is the point in the older analysis where they start saying that Karpov's positional vision just completely overwhelmed Portisch in this game, and bishop xf3 is the culmination of a brilliant positional plan that comes to fruition through the rest of this game. Nothing of the sort. White's still slightly better here. Giving up the setting it as two bishops versus two knights is very dangerous, because the bishop pair is always an asset, and having two knights against the bishop pair is even a little bit more dangerous. Queen d6 is another way of doing things. I think this is a little bit safer for black. Knight g4. This is a common tactical device in these positions. Basically, and you see this in a couple other openings. One that springs to mind would be the Siberian variation against the Smith-Morra. So obviously the threat is bishop takes f3, followed by queen h2 check. But here white can just routinely knock things back. 6, and then white forces the queens off. I think black is solid here, but only white can be better. These hanging pawns are not a weakness. Again, because these knights are so passive, they're sort of locked into each other. These are Dvoretsky's superfluous knights. They don't really have a great square to hop to in these current tracks. The bishop pair is incredibly strong, and these hanging pawns are always going to be threatening to be mobile. a4, a5, in fact, a4 might be the best move here, is a very common idea in these hanging pawn structures that we'll look at in further instructional games. The positional idea is to play a5 to either force bxa5 to create a passed c pawn and a weakness on a7, or you trade on b6 to create an isolated pawn on b6 that you can attack. But in this particular position, only white can be better. I think black is solid, and I think it's a little bit less dangerous than the game choice. But this will be very dangerous to work with black. Bishop x3 carries its own risks. So queen x, and then the point of taking an f3 is this move, e5. So we've looked at this pawn break in the past few games, and the pluses and minuses. You don't want to overestimate the blockade. It's good to be positionally oriented and thinking about blockading these hanging pawns, because an immobile target is a weaker target. But and in the game, Portisch immediately goes wrong. Just give away the square. Queen g3 was played, which is just nonsensical. d5 is the obvious move. So don't be overwhelmed by fear of the blockade. Obviously, the knight has a strong outpost on c5 to go to. But this pawn on d5 is always going to be an asset. No matter what, this is a passed d pawn. And it's very strong. It's taking up space. It's an asset for white. In this particular position, white owns the bishop pair against two knights. Now, e5, d5 sort of closes the position, but white still has excellent diagonals leading to the king side. This blockade hasn't blocked out this bishop pair, so it hasn't actually decreased white's activity. d5 is simply the best move here. I think white's just slightly better. And this flies in the face of the sort of flowery, talky analysis that you see in the older books, where they talk about the moves, but they don't actually provide much analysis. I think white is slightly better here. Knight c5 is the best move. Just an example of what it's like when you just passively maintain the blockade. Queen d6 looks pretty, but it doesn't actually accomplish anything. b5, that's sort of an emergency move. If black just remains in place, this is just a better position for white. You know, he's got the bishop pair, he's got space, he still has good attacking ideas against the king side. This is just better. And white still has a pawn break with f4 to work with that he can time properly. It's not enough to just blockade these pawns. That's a passive idea in itself. The blockade has to bring an active idea out of it. You know, the knight has a pretty square in c5, but if that outpost for the knight isn't leading to something, it's just a post for the sake of it. It doesn't accomplish anything on its own. b5 was the other option. That's sort of an emergency break. But again, this is just sort of transmuted white's advantage a little bit. White has the bishop pair in open position. He has a queenside majority that's very strong, and he still has good at kingside attacking chances. This is a much better position for white. Knight c5 is the best move after d5, but even in this case, e4, black has to play a move like this. Again, he can't passively sit. Queen d6 would be sort of a passive blockading move. But this is near decisive advantage for white, because he still has that pressure against the king side. He's got that pawn break with f4, and black's position is just a pure passive blockade. It doesn't have any active play. You need to be developing your own counterplay. It's not enough to just sit in front of these pawns and laugh, because white, he's got the bishop pair and he's got kingside attacking chances. He's going to be developing his own play. So e4 tries to develop that. Queen d6. I think black is solid here. I don't want to overstate white's advantage, because getting the pawn to e4, it has developed active chances for black. He's got an outpost on d3, potentially. He can pirouette this other knight into e5, then land it in d3. That would be an active idea for his own. But I think white is for choice here. White's got this strong passed d pawn. Again, that's always a consequence of that e5 pawn break, which is why you want to assess those positions soberly. That passed d pawn does matter. It is an asset. White's got the bishop pair. That's always an asset. White's got an advantage in space. Again, because of the pawn on d5, that's sort of a definitional advantage that he has. And he still has kingside attacking chances. So, there's just no reason to avoid d5. It's falling into... The blockade looks nice, but it's not an active idea in its own. A blockade is a passive idea, unless the blockade in itself is achieving some active counterplay. Just sitting in front of these hanging pawns isn't enough. So queen g3 just falls into fear of the hanging pawn blockade. So e takes, this is obvious. Rook x e8, this just immediately goes wrong again. Bishop f4 needed to be played. This is a long semi-forced line that I'll just give. And this is completely balanced. f4 is going to come to chase this knight away. This d-pawn is passed, but it is somewhat of a weakness. Most likely we're just going to liquidate down to a rook ending. That'll be completely balanced. But rook x e8 is just completely bad. And black's simply up a pawn. And it's a very strong passed d-pawn. Knight c5 will help break the blockade. It is instructive to see how Karpov slowly untangles and converts. This is still a dangerous position because white has the bishop pair and they're aimed at the king side. But Karpov, especially back in 1978, he had that sort of deadly technique that he was already known for. Knight c5, that's where the knight belongs. Bishop e5 would be a better choice, just to try to develop active play. White's going to win the d-pawn. He'll still have the bishop pair, so he'll always have chances just based off that. But black's up a pawn. It's a passed a-pawn, so it's pretty strong. Black will never lose this. d1. d6, aiming at the weak c-pawn. King f8. This is a nice move that I wanted to highlight. This is a definitely a move that you would describe as Karpovian. Just a nice, quiet move that slowly improves the position. Bishop x h6 was always a random tactical chance, so black just takes that arrow away from white's quiver. So just that nice little improving move that Karpov is so well known for. Queen x c4, there's no reason not to take. Knight d6. Again, now the knights are looking better than the bishop pair. Knight c5, the knights are definitely looking stronger than the bishop pair. And I'll give the rest of the game without comment. I mean, black's 2 pawns up, now 3 pawns up. This is just over. G8. And Portisch finally resigned. We reached the end of the time control. He could have resigned in good conscience back here. But I'm guessing they were... back in the days, back in 1978, the time control was at move 40. That's back when we moved. That's back when we used wooden clocks and you're allowed to smoke at the board. I started chess just at the very tail end of that. Of course, when I started smoking, you had to actually go outside to have a cigarette, which is terribly inconvenient. But it's a very straightforward game from Karpov after a certain point. The two main parts that I wanted to really emphasize, the reason why I selected this game to go over, this moment here, we've talked about it before, but it's important to understand when it's appropriate to go for a hanging pawn and when it's appropriate to go for an isolated pawn, because the difference between those two is often razor thin. Here, and again, this is a function of not just modern theory knowing more, but here, this is a situation where the isolated pawn is just superior. And again, the mnemonic devices for recognizing that are often who's made what moves. The fact that rook c1 is on the board, it's not an aggressive part of the typical isolated queen-pawn scheme. So that makes it a little bit more beneficial for black to go to, because rook c1 is sort of a semi-wasted move for an isolated queen-pawn structure. But it makes perfect sense in a hanging pawn structure. The fact that the light square bishop is already resolved. Usually in in an isolated pawn structure, that light square bishop is a problem piece. Here, it already has a perfect, beautiful diagonal, and black doesn't have that problem to worry about. So heading for the hanging pawn structure here was a bit of a mistake for black. But the main point of what I wanted you guys, gender neutral, guys and girls, to take away from this is the c5 moment. We've been going over this e-pawn break against the hanging pawns for the past few games. Don't be afraid of the blockade. The blockade isn't necessarily good or bad. It's neutral, and it depends on the specific factors of the position. Here, Portisch was just pathologically afraid of the blockade for the sake of the blockade. But remember that this is an asset. This passed d-pawn is an asset. Even if the knight looks beautiful on c5, even if the queen blockades the d-pawn on d6, that passed d-pawn is still an asset. It still takes up space. It still immobilizes black to a certain extent. That's why when you're playing the e-pawn break and allowing the d-pawn to advance, you need to very carefully assess the positional factors. Here, it's better for the hanging pawns because we still got this bishop pair, we have an advantage in space, and we have kingside attacking chances. Black doesn't have any active play. The blockade in itself is not an advantage. It's what you're achieving with the blockade. If the blockade were achieving active play where you're undermining these pawns somehow, that would be great. But here, just sitting passively in front of the blockaded pawns isn't enough, because white has that bishop pair. He has that edge in space. He has that edge in mobilization. It's not enough to just passively sit in front of the hanging pawns. That's, again, why the e-pawn break needs to be very carefully assessed, because you're handing white, or the side with the hanging pawns, a protected passed e-pawn. You need to carefully assess the positional factors and what play you're achieving against the hanging pawns. So, another good positional game. It broke down pretty quickly after Portisch misplayed this and got afraid of the blockade, but Karpov converted pretty nicely, pretty instructional in the opening moments. Next game, we're going to move on to examining b-pawn breaks. That'll be a slightly shorter course, because that tends to be more specific and tactical. There's not as many positional factors, but we will go over one or two examples of that. My name is John. I'll see you then.